Super Mario Brothers. Your parents know him, Graham and Pop know him, and there's a greater than zero chance that your dog's practicing bottom clip inputs for his no thumbs any % speedrun as we speak. The game is bigger than the Beatles, which according to the Lennon calculation makes Super Mario Brothers bigger than cheese and rice. But why is Super Mario Brothers so big? Was the game really that good, or is it a case of history being rewritten by the victor? And the more important question, is it even worth playing today? Grab some snacks as we get into Super Mario Brothers. Everybody knows the history of Super Mario Brothers, but in case you've touched grass or left the basement in the last 35 years, I'll fill you in. By the mid-1980s, Nintendo was looking past the arcades and into the home. The Famicom released in 1983, and Nintendo had been steadily bringing their arcade classics into Japanese homes as well as making console exclusives. Koji Kondo, the composer for the original Super Mario Bros., and probably around half of your childhood if you grew up with Nintendo, remarked that the Famicom's ability to bring arcade games home was his favorite part. It was certainly a selling point in Japan, but Shigeru Miyamoto and Nintendo thought that their home console could do something more. Miyamoto got to work with a team of pretty much complete noobs. Miyamoto and programmers Toshihiko Nagako and Kazuki Morita had been at the company for years, but designer Takashi Tezuka and composer Koji Kondo were fresh into the company. Miyamoto said that each member was doing specific roles, which was not only new for game development, but also helped the game production run smoothly, which is something they desperately needed it to do. Miyamoto and his team were on a dreadfully short deadline, only about 6 months. Nintendo needed a launch title for the release of the Famicom in the United States as the NES. In hindsight, of course the console did well, but at the time Nintendo needed to pretty much hide the fact that it was a console at all. See, the console market had been nuked by Atari, shitty games, poor quality control, and corporate greed. The great North American console crash of 1983 still had the home console market devastated, losing 97% of its peak profits by 1985. Nintendo wouldn't just need any game, they would need a killer app to usher in the revival of the home console market in the United States. Naturally, since Mario was already a well-known property in the United States, they decided that he would be the character to lead them into the console market. Knowing all of this, the team got to work on what they nicknamed the Great Culmination. The general idea was to take all the best ideas displayed in the Famicom games released up until that point and smash them all together. It was meant as a final send-off to cartridges as Nintendo prepared the Famicom to accept larger capacity discs. The initial plans for the game illustrate this idea of culmination with plans that are a far cry from the Mario that we know today. Actually, they have more in common with Far Cry than Mario Brothers. The game initially was going to have Mario flying around with a goddamn rifle and a beam gun. He would go from stage to stage with a bloodlust matched only by his firepower, gunning down everyone in sight while he rode on his rocket. Super Mario was going to be doing goddamn bombing runs, torching towns, and committing motherfucking war crimes. Okay, maybe not the last part, but these were the design documents written up at the time. At some point in development, these ideas were thrown out, but Miyamoto notes that these conversations are what led to the control style of Zelda being created, which I can kind of see from these documents. Little by little, the team pulled together what would work, what was feasible, and what felt right to do considering the character. Miyamoto was working against the clock with an inexperienced team, but they somehow pulled their ideas together to produce not just something good, but something that would go on to define themselves, the company, and gaming as a whole for decades. The game wasn't just a market success, but a market boom that would bring Nintendo a whopping 70% of the market share by 1988. Given the general consumer trends at the time, I think it's safe to say that if Nintendo had released the NES in the States without something like Super Mario Bros., it wouldn't have been the success that it was. Super Mario Bros. May just be the reason for the return of the home console in the United States. Before getting into the actual game, I think it's important to look at some of the alternatives for context. But really this segment just exists because I sat down and played some really old platformers and I'll never use this footage anywhere else. So Pitfall 2 was released for the Atari 2600 about 16 months or so before Super Mario Bros. And it looks like this. It was a sequel to Pitfall, which was a huge success for Activision on the Atari, and the sequel actually is quite the improvement. The game has checkpoints, ditched lives, has a massive map, varied enemies. It's like the first one, except it's only bigger and better. But God, these physics suck. The jumping is clunky, the movement is strange, and don't even think about falling. You'll be falling for the rest of all time. The game, while good in its own right, is leagues below what Nintendo would release a little over a year later. One of the other games I looked at for context is h.e.r.o, another 2600 game by Activision in 1984. This game completely eschews the jumping scheme. Instead of jumping, the main character has the ability to fly. The idea is alright, but I don't think it really works. Part of this has to do with the controls. You don't use the one button on the Atari 2600 controller to take flight, but instead hold up on the stick. And since the game doesn't have Hadoukens, I feel like this control scheme is a sin. What's next? Oh, a forgotten classic, Jet Set Willy, which has a beautiful cover of a man puking in a toilet after spray painting his own name in the bathroom. Who said that video games can't be art? And while Jet Set Willy has a huge world to explore and is generally interesting enough I might go back to someday, it's still no match for Super Mario Bros. In terms of play control or speed. Willy is big, slower than syrup, and made of fragile bones that explode when you fall down too far. It's more like a Metroidvania than a traditional platformer. It's neat, but still not really in the same ballgame as Super Mario Bros. The closest game in my exploration of the pre-Super Mario Bros. Platformers is actually our old pal Pac-Man in the arcade game Pac-Land. I was honestly shocked at how well this felt to play, especially after playing those Atari platformers. If Packers ran with a button instead of double tapping the stick, it would feel almost identical to Super Mario Bros. I know I dunked on Pac-Land in the past, but honestly this game is pretty awesome. Still not sure it's the best Pac-Man stage in Super Smash Bros., but that's for you to decide. It is important to remember that Packers stayed in the arcade while the rest of these games were things that you could enjoy at home. I know that there's other games like Ghosts and Goblins that I'm not going into here, but I think that those games are going for quite a different style and a different approach to what a platformer even is. This section doesn't just exist to say, oh look, Pitfall 2 bad, Super Mario Bros. Good, but also it is kind of just to do that. Many of the comparable platformer games coming out at the same time lacked elements that would go on to define Super Mario Bros. Success. Pretty much none of them had smooth horizontal scrolling, smooth control, or level-based structure. Not that level structures like Jet Set Willy are bad by any means, but these games set out to do something different than Super Mario Bros., and they achieved it to varying degrees. I wanted to give you that little bit of context and also remind you that Super Mario Bros. Is old as fuck. The game is nearly 36 years old, running on 38-year-old hardware. That's greater than the life expectancy in 1820. Super Mario Bros. Has aged better than the other games that we looked at, but just like your mom, it's definitely showing its age. If you're blind, the first place that you'll notice this age is in the way that the game plays. Some have complained that Super Mario Bros. Controls badly or has bad physics, but that's why I showed you all those other games so you don't say something stupid like that. If you compare the physics of Mario in this game to a newer game like New Super Mario Bros., it might not be as tight as that. But why would it be? This game is over 3 decades old and one of the first of its kind. The fact that the game isn't as responsive as a 15-year-old platformer shouldn't be a surprise. And just saying that New Super Mario Bros. Is 15 years old makes me feel ancient. I think that it's unfair to outright compare the game to newer entries in the series, but it is fair to critique it through the eyes of a modern player who hasn't played it. I think that it's fair to critique the physics because they are quite stiffer and more rigid than in future titles. Better than the games around the same time, but things got better from this point. And while they are pretty rigid, it's something that I adjusted to almost immediately and it never really bothered me. I think for a modern player, the game will be very easy to get into after the first level. This is probably thanks to the invisible tutorial that is World 1-1. If you start the game and have no idea what you're doing, you'll realize that going left takes you nowhere. Super Mario Bros. Is a game where you only go one way. Once you take off to the right direction, you're faced with your first set of obstacles and challenges. There's a guy on the ground, a box with a question mark on it, and brick blocks. The game is set up so you'll pretty much have to jump on top of this guy. If you try and jump over him and miss, you'll probably land on his head. Without text or anything, the game teaches you how to attack all the enemies in this game. You jump on them. If you miss in another way, you'll smack your head on the block and see a coin appear, teaching you that you'll get a reward by hitting your head on blocks. The brick blocks don't seem to do anything when you're small, but if you're skilled enough to grab the mushroom, then you'll hit them with your head and have them explode. Even after this small section, the tutorial continues. There's pipes of increasing size, showing you the nearly maximum jump height that Mario can achieve, while also making sure that you know how to jump as high as possible. Also, if you're fast enough, the game shows you about the maximum jump distance between these two pipes. In this way, the game is a wonder of design, but its actual efficacy I'm not too sure of. In 1985, this kind of tutorialization was likely necessary and extremely useful, but in the modern day, I would wager that Mario is so ubiquitous that even without this type of proving ground, people would still know how to play the game. I think if you polled people, most would know that you stomp on a Goomba to kill them and grab a mushroom to grow, either through direct interaction with the series, or through the cultural osmosis that a game this large enjoys. Once you know all these mechanics, it's about putting them all together, and once I got over the way that Mario felt, I found myself getting into a rhythm. Even before the discovery of crazy glitches, I can see why this game was attractive to speedrunners, and that's because it's just a really fun game to blaze through. Mario has hefty momentum that he carries into jumps. His heavier feel makes the platforming a little more challenging than in some future games, but it's still fun to do here. This same heft is felt on the ground too. Mario takes longer to hit full speed and longer to slow down. Managing Mario's momentum in this game is still as fun some 36 years later, which I didn't really expect. This weight and momentum is what all those other games we looked at lacked. Pac-Land was the closest, but it was still locked in an arcade and it didn't really feel as smooth as our Morbid Plumber does. I've never seen a nearly 40-year-old move this smooth, and it's clear why Nintendo more or less owned the genre moving forward. They tapped into this sense of warped reality that other platformers were having a hard time finding. They brought a real sense of weight while ignoring things like a reasonable jump height and the strength of Mario's bones. They also tapped into some fantastic sound design. Koji Kondo released one hell of a soundtrack for this game. The tracks are simple but have a repeatable quality to them that not all games have. He designed these tracks to be listened to over and over again, and it shows. While some games' soundtracks get annoying after repeated playthroughs, this game really doesn't. Also, they were wise to have nearly every action in the game make a noise from jumping to running into a block. The music plays directly into the rhythm of the game, with each jump, stomp, and pipe acting almost as percussion to the music. It's clear that Miyamoto asked Kondo to do the music after the game was done, because otherwise the music wouldn't sound so natural to the way that the game plays. In an effort to save space, Kondo reused a bunch of noises in the music and the sound effects. An example of this is Mario shrinking is the same sound as Mario going down a pipe. I bet you never thought about that, huh? You learn something new every day. That's not to say that Mario's first console outing is an open seas smooth sailing experience. There's definitely places that it could improve. One place that it falls short is in the graphics. I know it's dumb to critique an NES game for its graphics, considering the Atari was making this a year before, but I don't think the game looks that great. Sue me. And a lot of it has to do with the repetition. We have the Mushroom Kingdom during the day, the Underground, the Mushroom Kingdom at night, which is just the daytime Mushroom Kingdom with a black background, the Underwater, which is kinda cool, but the levels themselves kinda suck. These bubbles are a neat touch though. And finally, the castle sections. I know it beats Pitfall's never-ending jungle, but the levels kinda run together more than I would like. There's also the castle levels themselves. I didn't find any of the castle levels to be particularly bad, but there are some strange design choices on display here. First is the fact that you fight Bowser at the end of all of them. I know from a lore perspective it's not actually him each time, but it's a little weird. He's not really hard for most of the castles, although he does get more difficult as time goes on. He gets more difficult, particularly when he starts throwing shit, which reminds me of these guys who I fucking hate. These dudes are the only really difficult part of the game, I swear. But Bowser's seemingly random movements can make him just as annoying as the Hammer Brothers. But without him in the castle levels, there probably wouldn't be any challenge in this game. Also, one castle in particular sucks, 7-4. What the hell is this? I understand that it's a puzzle and I was able to figure it out, but it was a complete trial and error process. It's like Miyamoto had the idea for the Lost Woods right then and there and said, we need to throw it into Mario Brothers, let's do this shit. I don't recall any other puzzles in this game, so it's just really weird that there's a random trial and error dungeon that shows up for one stage and then never comes up again. The one other soft complaint I have is that the game is too easy and pretty short. If you know what you're doing, you can beat the game in 5 minutes, and if you slightly know what you're doing, you can beat the game in about 20 minutes. Even if you play every single level in the game, it probably won't take you more than about 2 hours. I know that the developers were low on space and crammed in as much as they could, but it's just a bummer that the game's as short as it is. I think that this length issue could also be alleviated if the game was just a little bit harder. It's harder for me to judge the difficulty of the game because I've played this thing to death. But to me, the game is too easy. Besides these minor complaints, I think that the game's actually still a lot of fun. Truth be told, I went into this game preparing to tear it apart, but I was pleasantly surprised to see that it's aged decently, aside from the graphics and some other minor complaints. You do have to meet this game halfway if you want to have an enjoyable experience, but I think that it's one worth having, and I would still recommend people have to this day. As far as if it deserves to be on the top 100 list, well, I'm not going to make any decision on that until I run through the other retro 2D console games. The next Mario game I'm going to take a look at will be The Lost Levels, which is a direct sequel to this game. Even though it doesn't currently have a spot on the top 100 list, maybe it deserves one? I honestly wouldn't know, I haven't played it. So do you guys think Super Mario Bros. Holds up today? Is it really one of the greatest games of all time? Let me know and I'll see you all in the next one.
That's right, we're Japanese.